When I'm composing today, I will do a lot of it in my head before I start writing anything down. Because I've noticed when I'm working and notating as I go, I start making these decisions that sort of look better on the sheet music. They look better on the page, and it fits a little neater in the score. And when I'm just recording the pieces as I've improvised them and as I come up with them, and then after the fact say, okay, how am I going to fit this into the page? Then it can be a little more challenging, but I think it preserves a little bit more of the music that I wanted to come across in the first place.
Today's guest made his Carnegie Hall debut at age 12. His classical training led him to Eastman and the Cincinnati Conservatory. Then he began transcribing traditional Navajo chants for solo piano and composing his own work. His compositions and recordings have become beloved and essential repertoire. Today, we talk about his journey from award-winning pianist to inspirational composer, translation, and getting more Indigenous works into the hands of piano students. Welcome, Connor Chee. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to see you. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me.
I've been really excited to have you on the show since we started it. I think we met at NCKP. I was new to the Alfred scene because Fonz had just come into that family. And I was standing right in front of your rack of sheet music at the Alfred booth. And so my first introduction to you was people pushing me out of the way to get to your rack of sheet music and think, wow, this guy really sells a lot of sheet music. People are really interested in that. So anyway, thank you for being here.
Yeah, that's what I love about those conferences. You get to meet so many different people, and I try to make it as often as I can because I meet so many amazing teachers and educators and performers, and no, those are some of my favorite things.
Is it fun for you? It seems like a lot because you always have a gaggle of folks around you when you walk into the booth. Do you enjoy that environment, or is that overwhelming?
I do. I enjoy it. No, I love meeting people and talking to, teachers about things that they're interested in, talking about their students and talking to performers. I don't take that conversation time for granted.
Is most of your work, your pedagogical work and your sheet music, most of it's more upper intermediate? Is that what we would call it?
Yeah, I think sand paintings is late intermediate, early advanced.
Yeah.
But I'm working on a set of intermediate pieces, something that's a little bit more accessible to more people, to more students.
Okay. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's going to be a set of 12 short pieces that are inspired by the Navajo calendar, the 12 months and the names for them in Navajo and what those mean. That's sort of the inspiration. So it's called Nahai, which is the Navajo word for a year. And so the idea is to take you through a year in sort of through the lens of the Navajo people and how they see the months and how they've named the months.
Oh, that's awesome. And when's that coming out?
That's coming out in October.
Okay, and this will be in October. And the goal of this is for the pieces to be a little bit more accessible, is what you're saying. There'll
Yes.
be more intermediate to where more people can play them at an earlier age or earlier stage.
I feel like a lot of Native and Indigenous composers in general have music that's a little bit more advanced. So I think that there is this need out there for more accessible pieces that, students can start to learn at a younger age or in the earlier levels of their training.
And can we just go back a little bit? Because speaking of that, I wanted to ask you today, and I was going to ask you later, but I'll just ask you now, is that you were this kind of prodigy playing at a really high level at a really young age. And I was wondering if it makes it difficult to write music for other people aside from yourself when technical facility was something that probably came to you very young, obviously, and performance capability came to you very young. Is it hard? Like, do you rely on Davis a lot, I'm guessing, to maybe help you?
Yeah, in my experience, I think for every composer that I at least in the Indigenous community that I've been working with, because I work with a lot of composers, it seems like a challenge for most composers to write something that is accessible, something that's a little bit easier, because it's sort of like you have more limitations placed on what you can do, and you still want to write interesting music. You still want to write, original music. So keeping all these extra things in mind while you're composing can be challenging. And it is great to have somebody like Davis as an editor who can point out those things which are just a little bit outside of what you would want for an ideal, set of pieces that, let's say, at the intermediate level. it's always great having somebody else look over it. And I've done it myself for other composers where I was, looking at their music. I think a lot of it is just having a fresh set of eyes and ears also.
Mhm.
And everybody's technique's a little bit different too, because even with some of the more advanced music that I was writing, my fingering choices are very unique to me. And so it's also helpful to have other people play through and be like, this is a little awkward. I think more people might like it this way because, everybody's different. Everybody's hands a little different and different fingering choices. So there's definitely things that appeal to a wider audience than maybe specifically myself.
Oh, that's really interesting. So could you talk a little bit about your creative process? And if you follow your work and your social media and your website and all of your contributions and how you put content out there and art out there, it's great that you're very open about the process of where inspiration comes from. But can you talk a little bit about just the process of how you say come about writing a new collection of work?
I sometimes think about that myself because I'm like, I wish I had a more of a process that I could just lock into and start creating music. I feel like I spend a lot more time in my head before I even sit down to write a note of music, coming up with a plan or a structure or the inspiration. And oftentimes that involves consuming other art, whether it's visual art or different genres, different styles of music that can inspire me. I'm always inspired when I see somebody else doing something and they're really great at it, no matter what it is. That sort of sparks my own creativity. Like, I want to do something really great. I want to do something that I'm really proud of. And so after I spend that time in my mind thinking about the piece, thinking about the inspiration and maybe the structure, maybe, how long I want it to be, then I can start to sit down and mostly it starts with improvising. I'll improvise at the piano until I find a melody that I like. And I'll kind of push that around a little bit until it feels right. And so everything sort of comes from that. I think I definitely am a composer that is first and foremost, I focus on the melody. And then everything else, the textures, the harmonies, the structure, that all comes after I have that hook, if that makes sense.
But the melody's the anchor, and that's
Yeah.
what you're trying to find. And it sounds like what you're saying is that you live life, right? You
Yeah.
go out, you have an idea, you see things that inspire you, and you kind of compound that in your thoughts. And then
Yes.
from that, maybe you take notes or something like that, or write down little ideas. And then you sit down at the piano and you start meditating on those ideas and working through them and trying to bring them into a melodic idea. That's your,
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't take notes like physically. I do take mental notes, but I'm also, I think, very bad about writing things down. And I don't know if that comes from the fact that a lot of music in Diné Navajo culture is an oral tradition. It's passed on orally. But for the first time I started composing, when I wrote these first arrangements of some traditional chants and songs, I didn't write any of them down. I had 15 pieces that I'd recorded, and I hadn't written any of them down in sheet music form. It wasn't until people started asking for them one at a time, I'd be like, okay, which one do you want? And I'll write that one down and send it to you if you're interested. But it was all just living in my head. And so there is still some music out there that I've recorded and put out that I have not written down. I'm trying, I'm trying to be much better about that.
and that is a secret to your sound, right? That right there, the basis for your composition being inspired by an oral tradition and that culture of not writing things down creates a different end product, right? Because
Yes.
we are taught as composers to be constantly notating everything, all of our little ideas. We don't want something special to slip away. But in a lot of traditions, especially in oral traditions, it's that core idea, right? And I think that's a great element of your style that I think you can hear in the finished pieces, right?
Yeah, I think even when I'm composing today, I will do a lot of it in my head before I start writing anything down, because I've noticed when I'm working and notating as I go, I start making these decisions that sort of look better on the sheet music. They look better on the page, and it fits a little neater in the score. And when I'm just recording the pieces as I've improvised them and as I come up with them, and then after the fact say, okay, how am I going to fit this into the page, then it can be a little more challenging, but I think it preserves a little bit more of the music that I wanted to come across in the first place. So I noticed that with my first, I'd record these albums and not write anything down. And then after the fact, go back and listen to everything that I did and figure out, okay, what's the best way to represent this in the sheet music? Because in my experience, sheet music, our notation system, it's great and it's very nuanced, but it still doesn't always capture exactly what a composer wants. That just goes into my training as a performer and dissecting the score and trying to figure out really what's at the heart of this composer's intention, whether it's Mozart or Beethoven or Rachmaninoff. And there's so many different interpretations because they're as nuanced as the notation is, there's still all this room for interpretation. There's all that wiggle room for what the composer might have actually wanted. And that's why we have so many, recordings of the same music, and they're all brilliant, that in their own ways.
Could you share a little bit about the oral tradition of the Navajo culture, but also the tonal tradition of the chants that you were first inspired by that became, I'm guessing that's a big part of the melodic grounding of your work. Can you describe that in its context too?
Yeah, so originally, so the chants are largely pentatonic. And so a lot of my melodic writing, I stick to a pentatonic melodic structure and a lot of diatonic supporting harmonies.
Mm-hmm.
And, that for me is a challenge. It's like a personal challenge. It's, you're working with less notes to come up with a new melody. And traditionally, that's all there was the melody. We didn't have harmony in traditional music. So that was something that I had to add after the fact and figure out a way to do that authentically, to do that in a way that still pays respect to the culture, even though I am sort of balancing this between, some things that are inspired by the traditional music of the Navajo people and also bringing it into this classical format and, the instrument that I studied, which was the piano.
And was that a journey for you to be able to bring those two worlds together?
Yeah, for the longest time, I was always very, proud of my identity and, my heritage. That's in my formative years, what I grew up with. It just had never really occurred to me to sort of bring the two together. I'd always, in my training, all the way up through my master's degree, was just envisioning myself being a performer and playing other people's music. And it wasn't until I went home and spent some time reconnecting with my family and my community, and specifically with my grandfather, who sang a ton of different traditional songs. He just had this library of knowledge of all of these chants. And so it was sort of an unexpected turn where I thought, well, I'll just arrange a few of these for the piano because that's my instrument. And that's my way of carrying on this tradition of passing down this music and keeping it alive. And I just originally thought these would be a few pieces I could just play for myself, maybe play as an encore, sprinkle them into like the traditional rep that I was playing. And it took a totally different turn where more people were interested in that. And I'd always had an interest in composition. I just never saw myself as a composer. Like in all of my electives, even though I was studying piano performance, I was always like, oh, but I want to take composition lessons just for myself, just because I like to do it. And it wasn't until I sort of did bring those two parts of my life together, this classical training side, and then the way that I was raised and the things I learned from my family and from my upbringing and my heritage, bringing those together sort of allowed that part of my career to blossom.
You needed to be a composer.
Yeah.
Like the universe forced you into becoming a composer. That's so cool. I want to hear, can you tell me about your grandfather? It sounds like that's a big musical influence there.
Yeah, I think my earliest musical influences really were him singing traditional songs. I think, speaking of NCKP earlier, I did one of their PEDX talks, and I wanted to try and find some video footage or things, from my upbringing. And I found through these old VHS tapes that I was sort of digitizing some videos of my grandfather singing to me when I was a baby, like not even old enough to talk. That was sort of my musical upbringing, sort of had that foundation, even though later on I started studying piano and, a different type of music. I think that the music we hear in our formative years really does carry with us. It has an impact. And so I think a lot of the way that I structure my writing, I might not even realize, that the things that I'm doing that sort of align with some of the traditional music because I heard that from such a young age. But he was a Hataalii, he was a healer, he was a medicine man, so he knew all of these songs that were both something you could sing publicly, but he knew a lot of the traditional ceremonial songs that are only, used, that are sacred and only during the ceremony. And that sort of relates back to this oral tradition of passing things down, because some of the music really can't be recorded. It shouldn't be recorded. And when they learn it, they actually will only learn it during the ceremony. They can't like go back and practice it the way that I can go practice piano, make sure I get it right. They can only practice it when the next ceremony happens, because they believe that music has this power to invoke something, and you don't want to be doing that and taking that lightly.
It would be inappropriate to record that music. Wow, that's amazing. And well, and if you're listening to this, because I feel like I knew this was going to be a very interesting story and a lot of nuance to it, but we all have a journey, right? Your music education started at a very young age before you became a classical pianist, which is where your story generally starts when you research you. But I agree with you. The idea of this world in your mind that you live in, that you compose in, it was probably created at a very young age from those songs. And then to have the fortune of a technical facility and a musical facility to become a concert classical pianist, right? And to develop that skill and take enough composition skills to classes to be dangerous, and then to go home and reconnect with your roots and be able to take, because if you didn't have that, it would be difficult to do what you've done as far as in the landscape of piano music and piano pedagogy, right? The way you've been able to create music that people can access and hear, and they can really feel it. And the encouragement is, if you're listening, is that we all have a musical journey, and we all had the music that was played for us when we were children. One of my favorite interviews I did on the show was with Angelica Cortez, who's the executive director of the Suzuki Association of the Americas. And she was just talking about her grandfather playing traditional songs for her in the kitchen and playing mariachi music and things like that. And just the description, she said he wasn't a good guitarist, he wasn't a great singer, but that the meaning behind that music is what made her who she was. And it was a great moment. It was just like this. And then we go off on our journey, and then we reach a point where we're able to take that input and develop our own unique output. Because I think that's you in the entire space of piano pedagogical work and just piano rep coming out now have a very unique niche, right? That you've been able to establish. And it's really important, and it's really well received. And I think there's two things. One is we can appreciate it and enjoy it, but also look inward to our own journeys of where we are, right? And what we've experienced and how we can find importance of our own musical experiences. Thanks for sharing that. That's so cool. I'm so glad I asked.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I owe a lot to my family, because, it was both in how I was raised and, my father really making sure that I was immersed in the culture, but also in them making an effort for me to get piano lessons when they saw that I was interested in the piano, because I grew up in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, and it was hard to find a piano teacher. They were having to drive me like 2 hours for a lesson and 2 hours back at one point, just because there was no nearby piano teacher that could offer me lessons. And so I definitely owe a huge amount of my career and any success that I've had to my family.
This is Page, Arizona. Is that what
Yeah.
okay. So can you describe that? What that scene was like? 5-year-old, is that you started playing when you were very young? 6 years?
Yeah, about 5 or 6.
What
Yeah.
was Page, Arizona at 6-year-old Connor like? What was that scene?
Even from now, it's very different because it's grown a lot. But when I was being raised, it was a small town where everybody knew everybody, and it was a border town to the reservation. So I spent a lot of time, in Page, that's where I went to school. That's where my family lived, but also on the reservation, which was, I say it's about an hour away, because they used to just have dirt roads for most of the way out there, so it took a little longer. But yeah, there was one piano teacher that I had, that I started out with, and I just had for a few months, because she wasn't trained in the way a lot of piano teachers were, and so eventually it was just hard to find a teacher. If there was a teacher in town, there was one teacher, and she was totally full. She didn't have any room for any more students. And so ultimately my piano teacher that I had found that I'd studied with was in Flagstaff, a couple hours away from Page.
What was it about piano? How did you know that piano was going to be your thing when you're 6?
My dad got a gift of like a little, basically a toy keyboard. It was just like this little tiny thing. And neither of my parents were really musical, but I was like fascinated with this little toy keyboard. And so I started just making up things on my own or playing by ear, things that I heard on the radio, or if I heard something on television or in a movie, I'd start to sit down and sort of figure out how to play that on my own. So that's when my parents were like, oh, he seems like he really likes this. And so I started my lessons on this little toy thing. And eventually my teacher was like, this is not going to cut it. Like he has to, if he's going to learn the piano, he has to actually get a real piano. So eventually my parents did invest in a piano. There was this piano truck that would come from like Utah and drive all the way down with a bunch of pianos on the back and come through like Page. And he brought all these pianos. Like, if you guys want to buy one, I'm stopping through Page here. And so they actually bought my first piano, which I still have and I still practice on today. It's a
No
Yamaha
way.
upright. And they got that Yamaha upright off of this truck that was driving through town because there was no piano store close by where they could just buy an instrument. They sort of had to wait for this truck to come. I think it was from like Cedar City, Utah, and drive down with these instruments that they would sell along this route they drove.
Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your dad hadn't gotten that gift of a piano or toy piano? Do you
Yeah,
think you would have found your way to the guitar or to the piano?
I feel like maybe at some point, I don't know. I think so many things do feel inevitable for people's musical journey that I don't know for sure. I can't say for sure, but the fact that I had this immediate fascination with it and being raised around music all the time, I feel like that was something that eventually I would have been drawn to. Maybe not the piano, I don't know, but music, I think, would be part of my life no matter what.
Was there classical music in your home?
My my mom had gotten one of those like compilation cassette tapes
Oh my
of like
gosh.
the best of classical music. And
Yes.
so I that was like I she would put that on in the car and I was like, wow, I really like this. I want to be able to play this, Mozart sonata. It was all the stuff that's like the most popular thing that it was this compilation thing. But I heard that and like I was super interested and I was like, I want to learn how to play that. Something about it, I was just drawn to it.
And this is when you're young. We're talking
Yeah.
single digits. You were hearing this. And when did you, so you start driving to Flagstaff. You have a teacher in Flagstaff. It's 2 hours away. How often did you do lessons? Once, did you go every week, every couple weeks? How'd that work?
I went once a week. It was like once a week on Saturdays, I remember, because there was one other student in Page who was learning piano. And so our families would take turns driving us down. So one
No
week,
way.
my family would drive both of us down. And then the following week, their family would drive both of us down, sort of to alleviate that burden of this travel every week, every Saturday for piano lessons.
We're talking a 5 hour round trip at minimum, 6 if there's 2 lessons every Saturday for piano lessons. At what age did you
Yeah.
start doing that?
I think that started when I was about 8 years old.
So there is a lot of love that would predicate having that kind of commitment to a kid having an interest in a piano, right?
Oh,
That sounds like there's a lot of belief and a lot of support. I think it's a very common recurrence of or occurrence of artists whose musical lesson journey was an arduous adventure, right? Where you had these long trips. It seems like there's something in those drives. I recently heard it was Lyle Lovett was giving an interview and he had a very similar story about his mom driving him to guitar lessons. And it was about an hour and a half to get to guitar lessons. And it was the way he described it was very similar to how you described it. And I've heard this theme a lot, and there's something to it. You grew up in this place that was so inspiring to you in so many levels, but your studies took you somewhere else at a really young age. And so then you're 8, you're going to Flagstaff, you're practicing probably a lot. You've got a piano now, you've got this upright from Utah that came in on the truck. Then
yeah.
what?
Well, when I was 10 years old, my family relocated to Cincinnati so that I could go to the performing arts school there and study music a little more intensely, which was a big decision. But I think because such a commitment had already been made with myself and with my family, as far as driving, 2 hours to get to a piano lesson, that when I was 10 and my parents were like, are you really going to be serious about this? So me at the age of 10, as serious as I could be, decided that, yeah, I would audition for the school, and I was accepted to the School for Creative and Performing Arts in Cincinnati. And so I actually went first. My sister she was already living out in that area. And so I went first, and I stayed with my sister for a few months until my family could sell the house and find a new job and move
Sold the
out.
house and found a job
Yeah.
for their 10-year-old to play piano? Okay.
Yep.
That's amazing. I was going to ask you, how many siblings do you have?
I have an older sister and a younger brother.
Okay. And so was your younger brother around yet when this was all going down?
He was very young.
Okay.
And I think he was maybe 3 years old, 2 or 3 years old when we moved.
Were you fearful or were you excited? Like, what emotion would you say described that move to Cincinnati when you were 10?
I was really excited, not just for the music, but also my mom's side of the family was all living in Ohio. So I was really excited to be around that family that I only got to see every once in a while.
Oh,
And I didn't get to see my sister a lot. So I was really excited to be able to be moving out there closer to family. But also, about the chance to study music in this school, that I knew was a really great school. It was also very intimidating. It was
oh,
scary going from, small town Page, America to going to school downtown Cincinnati. And the school started in the fourth grade and it went all the way through 12th. So we were all in the same building. It wasn't the same as me being in my elementary school. And so there was a lot of culture shock for me when we moved.
I was
Um,
wondering that. And was it difficult to leave your buddies behind from Page?
it was, yeah, I left behind my friends, I left behind my family, and that whole way of life. It was just so different.
Were you, when you left to go to Cincinnati and be a part of this program, were you like in the local newspaper? I would just imagine an article, and where I grew up in a very rural area too. And if that happened where I grew up, there'd be an article about it that local pianists going to this school in Cincinnati.
Yeah, there was some, I don't remember specifically if it was when I moved, but they did sort of highlight my progress in the piano world in the
I
local
knew it.
paper. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. So, were those years for you, fourth through 12th grade in Cincinnati? Were those, and plus, when you 2 years later, you debuted at Carnegie Hall when you were 12, right? And you're winning competitions and stuff. So, what was that childhood like?
It was very intense. I luckily, the other hard part is finding a teacher that's a match. And even when I was in Flagstaff, that teacher was really not a match for me,
Mhm.
and it made things difficult. And I was lucky that eventually, while I was at the Performing Arts School, I came to be studying with a teacher, Anna Weinstein, who was an amazing teacher and also super dedicated. And so when it came time for the competition, she was just so giving with her time, where she'd call my parents at the end of the school day and be like, Connor's coming home with me. We're going to practice. He can sleep in our guest room and we'll wake up and practice and I'll take him to school the next day.
Wait, no way.
And yeah. And my parents would be like, okay, because, that was sort of the sacrifice that everybody was making because, these competitions can be so intense. And so all of the training that I got was even more than I expected because it was outside of the school hours where we were studying, music alongside everything else every day. It was also becoming this thing where it was after school and before school. And also during the summer, my piano teachers sort of had a piano summer camp where we would come back to the school during the summer for like 5 or 6 hours Monday through Friday to study, to take lessons, listen to each other, practice.
It sounds like the
Yeah.
dream. It sounds like it was really fun for someone who loves to do this. What made your teacher there the fit for you? Did she get you, or was it that she was available to you, or did she see your unique talents, the way you heard things, or what was it that made that the fit? That was
I think there is also this history of like negative reinforcement with a certain type of teacher, which is what I had encountered for a long time, this negative reinforcement. And so when I finally encountered the teacher that was the right fit, when I encountered Anna, it was a totally different, it was like positive. It felt
Yeah.
good and it sort of made me love music again because there was a time when I was sort of like, this just doesn't feel good anymore. I love to play the piano, but I'm starting to dread going to these lessons and getting torn apart. And that sort of saved me in a way where I was able to be like, okay, this it doesn't have to be like that. I can learn and still feel good about going to my lessons.
Yeah, because culturally that style of teaching at that point for high level pedagogy is somewhat of an anomaly at that time, I think, right?
Yeah.
Where that that positive reinforcement, that thing. At what point did you did you feel like you were expressing yourself creatively? What point did you start to feel artistic freedom and start to feel you were finding yourself as an artist? Right? Because I think as we're developing as these really high level young players, often it's like the mechanics of it and the repertoire and the development. When did you start to feel like you were really flowing?
That's a good question. I don't know about as far flowing. I don't know because I still had so much to learn in my technique. And when I was in the school in Cincinnati, I had just so much to learn in terms of the technical aspects. But I still had this joy for music and for writing music. I mean, I was still composing things like just for myself and finding joy in the instrument. I think it wasn't until I really got into my college studies at Eastman with Rebecca Penny's that I was able to get a real grip on my technique to where I could feel like it flowed a little more so that when I had this idea of what I wanted to express in a piece, that I was technically capable of doing that. I think before that, I wasn't always technically, I didn't have that fluidity to do all the little nuances in the music. So I think that was really another turning point for me was finding someone who was so good at teaching technique, which is another thing I feel like is hard because there are so many great performers out there, and it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier is you can have this great technical facility and not necessarily be able to dissect why and how to teach that. And so that was my experience throughout all of my musical studies is that you can have someone who's really fantastic at playing but not always fantastic at conveying how to do that. And so when I encountered at a high level of how to learn technique, that really sort of changed things for me.
That opened up the doors for you to start to be Connor Chee, right?
Yeah.
Which is that's what we're all looking for when we go to a concert, is we want to see the person, right, and experience that person. And I think it just takes a long time. It can take a lifetime,
Yeah.
to find that thing that is so authentic. And in other styles of music, in the blues and rock and the stuff that we hear, you see this in artists all the time that aren't as technically proficient, but they can convey something that we're really looking for. And in classical music, it's so difficult because it requires so much effort and so much work, like you said, to develop the technique to then be able to really breathe life into the music, right? And to experience it and to be able to have your audience feel it as something. So that it sounds like your years at Eastman is when you developed that to the point. And then was it after Eastman that you went back home and found your music?
It was after Eastman. I sort of the seed was planted when I was at Eastman, just because there were these discussions as soon as we started about what do you think you might want to do with your career? Because, with a music degree, I remember them saying, like, what do you do? And once you get your degree, anything that you want. And so it being so open-ended, I did think, okay, what exactly am I going to do? And I was thinking about the things that were important to me. I was thinking about, the fact that I was very fortunate to have a family that went through all of these struggles to get me music lessons. And that's not the case for so many of the kids that are back on the reservation, back where I'm from. And so there was always this idea of returning at some point and coming back to the community and giving what I could. It didn't exactly take shape until after I'd finished my master's degree, which is when I went back to Cincinnati and studied at UC CCM. And so after I finished my master's degree is when I decided to go home to Arizona.
And what was that like? You had finished your master's, you're a concert pianist, you've got a lot of rep, probably ready to go. And then what? You've gone home. What was your plan?
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is that I didn't really have a plan, and that was part of the reason that I went back because I was considering getting a doctorate, but it just didn't feel right. I mean, I had been going through school and learning all these things, and Eastman was such a strong school for me academically, where when I transferred to Cincinnati, I had already taken a lot of these courses in my undergrad that most students hadn't. So I was having to redo these courses in my master's degree. And so a lot of that felt like going through the motions. And I also just wasn't feeling connected in my performance with the audience. Like I just felt there was something missing. So my idea really was to take some time off and reconnect with family and decide, is it really what I want to do? Do I really want to pursue a DMA? Am I wanting to try to get a job teaching at a university? Like, what is my plan here? And going home and just spending time with my music in a different way is what sort of led my path down to this world of composition and reconnecting with my culture and also bringing it into what I was doing in classical music.
Would you say that you have a strong sense of instinct and inner monologue? Because it sounds like, and by inner monologue, I mean these ongoing conversations with yourself, which is also how you said you compose. But these moments in your life where you're listening to, instead of what you should be doing, you're listening to what you're feeling is the right thing in this moment. And I think that's a skill that not a lot of people have. And that's what I'm curious about. It sounds like you have a sensitive relationship to yourself. Is that
Yeah,
yeah.
I would say so because, I also was someone who very much followed the rules growing up. And it was like, if there was the path of, okay, you get your undergrad, you go to graduate school, you get your DMA, that was sort of the path that I really thought I was going to follow. But I did have this sort of intuition where I knew that if something didn't feel right, like it fundamentally didn't feel like the right thing at the right time, that I had to follow that instinct as much as I wanted to follow the path that was set in front of me. And as much as I wanted to follow the quote unquote rules, of how you get educated, I did have that sort of intuition that led me somewhere else. And I'm so grateful that I followed that intuition because I wouldn't be doing what I am today.
Right. And we all are. We're so grateful you did that. Yeah. Was there a point when you imagined yourself just in a tux touring the world, being a concert classical pianist, playing for Sony or something like that?
Oh yeah, that was sort of like that was from my earliest memories of wanting to do music. That was sort of what I'd envisioned. But life has other plans.
Yeah. And it still would have been a real, a triumph for yourself and something you could have done, and also great for your community because it would have been able to take you back there more and bring awareness. But that shift when you went back to Page, you started being inspired by the music, you started composing, there was a thing that started happening that became what would become your career, right? Did you put together a collection of pieces and record them? What was it? Or were you starting to post on social media? What were the early actions you did to get that rolling? Because you're doing a whole new thing now. Now you're doing something that's not the prescription and you're having to figure it out. What was that like?
So I actually ended up moving to Phoenix, bigger city with more
Mhm.
resources,
Yeah.
and I was traveling up to spend time with my grandfather and my family when I could. But my first set of pieces that I composed, this collection, was actually the idea was just an album, a recording that I put together. And it was specifically because I was asked to do a fundraiser for the Wild Spirit Wolf Sanctuary in New Mexico. And so the idea was I was going to go out there and do like a little a concert for people to donate and raise funds for this nonprofit. And also these CD sales, like a portion of the proceeds were going to go to the sanctuary. So it was sort of this thing where I'd already been working on transcribing some of these traditional songs that my grandfather sang. And this opportunity came along where they'd asked to raise funds, and it sort of my instinct was just like, oh, I can record these, put them on a CD, and then these sales can help this nonprofit. So that sort of came together very, very organically.
Wow. It just gave you that little push. And
Yeah.
as that was happening, and you have your first gig and you're doing this fundraiser and you got the CD coming out. And this has become a through line to your career, by the way, right? This is that's kind of part of who you are, is that moment has definitely compounded and continued. What were your grandfather's thoughts on your early compositions?
My grandfather was always a big supporter of
Okay.
my music. And when had my Carnegie Hall debut at 12, he was there in New York.
Oh,
My auntie Tasha was out, doing Navajo taco sales to raise funds so that they could afford to travel and be there. And so he was there. And I remember seeing him in the audience because he was there, dressed up and in his cowboy hat. And I could see exactly where he was in the audience. And it made me feel so good that he was there. So yeah, he'd always supported everything that I did. And, eventually he came with me to New York to perform at the Native American Music Awards. And I played piano and he sang along with it. And that was
whoa.
a really great memory I had with him as well.
That must have been an experience that you remember very dearly.
Yeah, it was. I remember that dearly, and I also remember the challenges of it because it really highlighted the differences between how we think about music in traditionally in the Navajo culture versus this Western classical tradition. Because we practicing me playing piano along with him, there was no concept of a key, like what key we're going to do it in. It was sort of like we do it wherever he starts. So I'd actually learned this piece that we were doing together in all 12 keys. And so when it came time to go on stage, I had to hear where he started and then play it in that key,
Wait a
which
second.
was
So when he cuts loose, you have no idea which key he's going to be in.
interestingly, it was like when we were practicing, he pretty much always did it in A major. But
Okay,
the
so
day,
there,
the day of the performance, I think he was in F major.
okay, so we're not talking like A flat. We're talking like it could be A or it could be F.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. That and so in that moment, you've got to lock in a tonal center right then. And you're like, well, this is an A. This is going to be an F today.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Wow. Okay. And these are also the moments that shape who we are as musicians, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that is so cool. So you mentioned your auntie selling tell me about that again.
Navajo tacos. It's kind of a thing like to do fundraisers where you can do
Yeah.
a Navajo taco sale and to raise money for something.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. That's so cool. So in your grandfather was with you in New York City. He was a big part of that. And so how and your father, you guys play music together now, right? Is this correct?
Yeah, I wanted to record some of these chants that inspired some of my music, and so I'd asked my dad if he would be willing to sing some of these songs, which I think was also illuminating for him because he, I think, never realized how much his father knew because in him trying to learn these chants and sing them was a struggle. And he's like, I can't believe my dad knows like hundreds and hundreds of these songs all from memory, and I'm struggling to get through 2 minutes.
Huh. Why do you think that is?
I know I'm not sure. I think, you know, also just being raised from such a young age in music. And I think that, my dad has this really mathematical brain. And, he's gone into like mechanics and like the engineering type stuff. And it's just like a little different. And I think that he also started to realize a little bit more in depth what I was doing as far as bridging the culture in classical music because he never really had a hands-on experience like working in the studio recording anything before. So that was a new experience for him and him realizing how much dedication it takes to memorize even 2 minutes, let alone, these hundreds of songs that my grandfather knew.
Wow. Did he enjoy that process with you?
I think he did. Yeah. I think it was good for him to sort of reconnect or connect for the first time, maybe with the things that his father was doing that he was raised with. It was just, it's easy to take for granted these things. And I speak for myself too, where you're raised that way and you don't realize, that, my grandfather had this lifetime of work learning not just the music and the chants, but also all of the different ceremonial aspects for these things that can take days. I mean, you'll have medicine men, these Hataalii that are singing for hours upon end, and these ceremonies might take 4 days. And, they have to sing it the right way for the ceremony to be valid. And so I've heard people liken it to opera before because like what you're wearing and also the emotions that you're going through and also the songs, like everything sort of has to be just right. And it's very much that way. And it's easy to take for granted when you have somebody who just seems to do it with such facility and it seems so easy. And you just are like, oh, that's what grandpa does. To step back and be like, if you tried to do it, realize how difficult it is. You have sort of a new respect for all of it.
It's a whole different element of depth. It's a
Yeah.
different plane, right? It's 5D. It's like the next, it's just a whole different depth and it's a different art. And do you feel like, are these traditions and is that still being preserved and passed down?
Yes, it is. There's more of it that is getting lost as the language is lost. And my
Yeah.
grandfather didn't speak English at all, but there was really this, my parents' generation, there was this sort of cultural genocide in the boarding schools where,
Yeah.
my dad's generation didn't want to teach their kids to speak the language because they were thinking that it was going to hold them back because, that was what they were taught. And so as the language would get lost, a lot of the songs would get lost. But there is a revitalization effort for the language. And also, there's a lot of cultural preservation that happens. A lot of the schools on the reservation are very good about teaching the culture and the traditions. And even with all the terrible things that come with social media, I've noticed that social media has become a place where people from the community can connect with culture bearers in ways they might not otherwise be able to. If you're not living on the reservation, you're not living close to these people that are this wealth of knowledge about the culture, that you could still be living in a city like Phoenix and still be learning and still be finding out new things about the culture through social media or through some of the organizations they have, like the Phoenix Indian Center, where they have these community centers where you can still connect with and learn about the culture and the language.
Yeah, that's so wonderful to hear because it's so beautiful and it's that depth that you were just describing in those ceremonies that it's really important that that still exists because it's it's a very important and unique and beautiful cultural heritage and art. I have to tell you, I was absolutely blasting your new album last night through a good set of speakers. I was, doing some prep for this episode and it just was released on the 31st of July, right?
Yeah.
Your recording. Hey, the recording's great. The pieces are awesome. How important is it to you in your music for the themes and the ideas that you compose around? A lot of them are really difficult, right? Uh, for that being part of the experience of people knowing your music, how do you want people to consume your music and to understand your music and your art?
Yeah, I think, like I said, a lot more time coming up with these melodies and with sand painting specifically because all of the melodic content is related
Mhm.
because I wanted to sort of have that visual element represented in the music in the same way
Yes.
in a sand painting you have these images that rotate around the circle. I wanted the melodies to rotate around the circle. And so, the last pieces are actually the first ones that I wrote. And when you start out, they're in inversion, they're upside down. And then the next set of four are upside down and backwards, retrograde inversion. And then the next set is just the retrograde, it's just backwards. And then finally, for the last four pieces, the melody is the way that it's supposed to be. And so when I was creating these melodies, the last four that I wrote, I also had to be thinking about, okay, now if I do this upside down, is it still going to sound right? Or is it going to sound weird? I still wanted it to sound natural. So I was really pushing these notes around to where every note that followed seemed correct. It seemed inevitable. It felt like that's where it should go. And it also in all those other permutations to make sure that it sounded natural, that you weren't thinking that this sounds like, he's playing something backwards. It's a little weird. And so I think I spend a lot of time doing that so that the listener don't have to be concerned with necessarily the compositional devices I'm using. They don't have to listen and understand as they're enjoying the music how it was generated, but more so that they could perhaps feel that if they listen to the full album, there is this sense of resolution by the end, and that they can enjoy the melodic content, that it's relatable. And so, in that sense, yeah, I want people to be able to experience it without thinking about all of the technical stuff. And then later, for those who are really interested in that, who want to come back for another listen and sort of identify those different underpinnings that I have in the composition, I also hope that it appeals to that audience as well, the audience that goes a little bit more in depth and wants to know all of the technical aspects. So I hope that my music has those different layers where you can enjoy it or you can listen intently. You can listen to it in the background while you're doing other things, or you can sit down and very intentionally listen to it. I hope that it can appeal to both of those audiences.
I also love it on your social when you add in video. Right on your website, the first thing you see, right? Describe that first YouTube that comes up.
Yeah, I think video, I was hesitant to do any kind of like music video at first. I
Really?
just I just didn't want to do it. I mean, it was hard for me to want to record anything at first because I'm like, that's out there forever for people to
Yeah, of course.
to pick apart. And so I was hesitant to even record anything. But I did that and I got over that. And I had to have that same experience with the videos. But it was important because people consume music differently now. There is often a visual element, especially on social media, where, that enhances the music. It doesn't really have to detract from it. So when I was composing one of my albums that I did, Scenes from Denetra, that was specifically, I knew there were going to be a visual element. So as I was composing, I was thinking about how that could be visually represented, the different things I was doing on the piano, so that eventually when I worked with my filmmaker and my good friend, Michael at City Jr., he also was able to lock into those things and be like, I get what you were doing. He also is a musician and understood how to translate some of that pianistic technique or whatever compositional technique in the music to something visual, to where people aren't just hearing the music, but they're seeing parts of the culture, parts of the land that were the inspiration.
And I'm specifically talking about this video of the loom. And this
Yeah,
makes a lot of sense in the weaving because I wanted to ask you, did you write that music over that video? And now I'm guessing that video, I'm not sure, or was your music wrapped around it?
when I was writing the piece, I wanted to write a piece about weaving. My grandmother was a weaver, and I
Okay.
had these images in my head of her weaving and seeing the loom and thinking it looked like an instrument, like a harp. And
Yes.
so that inspired the textures, these harp-like textures in that piece. And then it was after the fact that I talked to Mikey, the filmmaker, about my inspiration. And he was like, I can capture that on film so that people can see just her hands running across the loom
Yeah.
like a harp.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
And sort
cool.
of, and
Okay.
just, yeah, translate for people what was in my mind when I decided what the inspiration would be, not just weaving in general, but actually sitting at the loom and interacting with it.
Yeah, if you're listening to this, go to Connor's website if you haven't and check this out. It's so cool. I fell in love with that. And I thought it was so awesome. And I love that. So you have a filmmaker, you have someone who helps you with this and who
Yes.
does, yes, because that's a whole nother creative process. And it sounds like it's someone who gets you and knows your aesthetic and knows what matters, which is really important. And you recently, didn't you just do were you doing an educational film shoot just recently?
Yeah, I
Okay.
composed a set of 16 etudes that were inspired by the culture.
Yeah.
And so I went out and we filmed these 16 short videos that are just going to be basically explanations of that element of the culture and then how it relates to the etude and whatever the etude is teaching the pianist about
Yeah.
technique, also inspired by what the culture teaches us.
And you're also touring a lot. It looks like you've got a lot of shows coming up. You're coming as far north as Portland, it looks like.
Yeah, I just finished a big stretch. I think I was pretty busy from January until the end of June
Yeah.
performing. And so now I'm back and I'll be home back into composing mode. So I'd say it's about 50-50 where I'm, either traveling to perform or staying home and composing and working on my commissions and new compositions.
Okay. And this is in Phoenix. So
Yes.
you're about half and half. And you're doing a lot of work with the Francis Clark Center too? Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That
What's that like?
that's been a really great relationship because I had done some panel discussions for them, and the CEO, Jennifer Snow, just approached me and said, hey, if there's anything that we can do to support like your vision or what you want to do, just tell me. She was so open about it.
Wow.
And so my idea was, as I mentioned earlier, that there's a lot of indigenous music out there, composers, classical composers, but the music is more advanced and it's not always accessible. So the Francis Clark Center, we worked together to create a book of 10 pieces by Indigenous composers for elementary piano, so that there was some
Mm.
more literature out there that was also authentic from Native composers from different tribes, so that students could learn about the different tribes there were, the different composers there were, the different inspirations, and is also sort of a supplement to a lot of the method books out there, which still some of them are so outdated and have these, like caricatures of Native people that are, not by a Native composer, that don't represent the culture accurately. So that was sort of the idea behind it. And so we're actually working on another volume now for intermediate level pieces by Native and Indigenous composers.
That is awesome. Jennifer Snow is someone who just gets it, and she understands what's important, and she understands the creative spark, and she knows how to get things done. That's an icon. What an iconic leader. I can imagine you two did amazing things together. That's so cool.
Oh yeah. It's been really great working with Francis Clark and with Jennifer and all of the people, all of the team there.
Yeah, that's very cool. And I wanted to, before we jumped off, I wanted to make sure that if people were listening to this and if they hadn't been able to really follow your work, is the best way to really keep in track of your day-to-day through social? You put a lot up on TikTok and Instagram.
Yeah,
and you're really good
stuff.
At it.
Instagram, TikTok, those are the big two. Facebook.
Yeah, and I like that for a lot of people in our space, they really struggle with that medium, right? And it seems like you're very comfortable there. And do you get help with that? Do you have assistance, or is that mostly you doing your thing?
It's just me doing my thing. So it's not always following the exact model maybe I should, but I try to at least, keep up with it and post on the stories and make posts to keep people updated on what I'm doing.
Got it. And we're going to make sure to share the links to your new album that just came out, and really looking forward to this next collection of work that's coming out in October. So I expect that's going to be flying off the shelves as well. I just thank you so much for making the time to be here today. This was such a great chat, and it was so cool to get to know you a little bit better and to hear your story.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to the 440 Podcast. If you found this helpful, subscribe at Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and leave a quick rating. It makes a big difference. To learn how to run your studio with less stress and more joy, visit makemusic.studio.com. I'm your host, Eric Branner.